Well, good afternoon, everyone, and it's really an honor to be here. And it was really, when I walked in this morning and saw everybody, so many people, and the enthusiasm, and I was really inspired and excited to be here. And I think that it's great to see all of you working together on this, and I just hope I can offer a few words that add to your conversation. So I'm going to talk about basis talk on the piece I did for EPA's blog, the Environmental Justice in Action blog, on February 11th of this year. And that is the 20th anniversary of the executive order on environmental justice. And it's called Evolving Visions of Environmental Justice and EJ Pioneers, Reflections on the Executive Order After 20 Years. And I have to tell you that I had the hardest time trying to put this talk together because I really wanted it to be inspirational and informative and meaningful, and I ended up wanting to do it from my own personal perspective and from the perspective of an official for US EPA, and a person who has really followed what's happened in Michigan all these years. So it was really fitting that we began this conference with words from Bunyan Bryant and his video. And Bunyan, as you all know, has been a real visionary and activist and teacher. And we're honored today by his spirit being here. And that's a perfect segue, I think, to what I was going to talk about first, which was the events that led up to the executive order on environmental justice, particularly Michigan's role in it. So that's Michigan's history, role in the environmental justice history, the birth of environmental justice. I was going to reflect on the 20th anniversary after 20 years, and then talk about EPA's current priority, one of Administrator Gina McCarthy's priorities, which is making a visible difference in communities. So going back to the history of Michigan's role in the birth of environmental justice, I guess I'll start it, from my own personal perspective, which is back in, I had been working on these issues, the intersection of race, poverty, and environment. And in 1982, as you all know, there was this incident in Warren County, North Carolina, Warren County being the one of the poorest and counties with the highest percentage of African American that was cited for a PCB landfill, and that led to a campaign of nonviolent civil disobedience. 500 people got arrested, and one of the things that took place there was my going down there and coming into contact with the organizations, or one of the organizations that spearheaded that, which was the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ. And I ended up going to work for the commission on this issue, traveled around the country, and realized how huge an issue this was. So in 1983, Congressman Fauntleroy, who was the delegate, the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, asked for a study that found that 3 out of the 4 off-site landfills in EPA's Region 4, which are the southeastern states, were located in predominantly African-American counties. And I said at that point is that, we need to replicate that. We need to on a national basis. And that led to the study that I did in 1987 called Toxic Waste and Race, which was the first demographic study, first study on the demographics surrounding hazardous waste sites. In many ways, that was a report that helped put the issue on the map. Shortly after that, Bunyan Bryant and Paul Mohai and Dorceta Taylor all got this idea to do this symposium at the University of Michigan that the race and the incidence of environmental hazards. And of course, I was invited along with many other what are now real legends in the environmental justice area. And I have to say that when I went to the University of Michigan, coming from this real activist background, right, I did not realize how there was a real core of commitment and to these types of issues in universities and in government. And I think that's important to mention because when we went and formed this small group, I think 7 or 8 of us, called the Michigan Coalition, and started to send letters to EPA and to ask them to engage around our issues. The impact that we had would never have been as great as it turned out to be if it were not for all these people at EPA that were working behind the scenes on an issue like this. And that, of course, and I think it's been mentioned over and over again, led to the formation or establishment of the EPA's Office of Environmental Equity, soon later to be renamed the Office of Environmental Justice, and then in 1994, the Executive Order on Environmental Justice. And that brings me in this talk to, looking at then what's happened over the last 20 years. And I want to start by making the point that the executive order was a product of community activism, community leadership, and a vision from the community. One of the things I think that that I would tease out in terms of in terms of the environmental justice movement is its vision, which is really building a healthy and equitable and sustainable communities for all people. And over the last 3 decades, 3 decades, there's been countless examples of how communities of color, low-income communities, and tribal communities have taken action that really very significantly influence environmental decision-making. And in the beginning, I would say that a lot of the activity that was going on in communities were responding to immediate impacts, what they saw in front of them as things which were, which they had to address. But really, at the core of what they were, what communities have been thinking about all the time were things that you've talked about throughout this morning, which has to do with preventing harms and mitigating harms, and then transforming communities. And you know, and the environmental justice movement, as it evolved over these years, was not just about addressing the negatives in a community, but about promoting positive things, bringing amenities into communities, talking about what makes for healthy and sustainable communities, things like jobs and housing, transportation, health, green space, and so on. And you know, and I think as things evolved over the past 20 years or so, this is really what you know, this movement is all about. And I just want to give some examples of that. You know, I went down to Warren County a couple years ago to be with them at the 30th anniversary celebration of the Warren County protest. And the thing that, the theme that they have for that celebration was building a healthy future. And what they wanted the legacy of Warren County to be was a positive vision of community health and sustainability. And so it really is, comes as no surprise that throughout the years, the partnerships that communities have brought together with universities and with other groups to work on environmental health and community sustainability issues have been like a hallmark. And I just wanted to kind of share with you some of the things that have been accomplished. You heard a lot about them, but you know, some of the things that stuck out in my mind was like in New York City, you know, the West Harlem Environmental Action got New York City to convert the buses or bring clean natural gas buses to the West Harlem community. The West Harlem community being the area where 5 out of the 6 bus depots for the borough of Manhattan were located. In North Carolina, there was a law that was passed banning hog farm facilities and setting higher, new hog farm facilities and setting higher standards for waste treatment, and that was as a result of a work by the concerned citizens of Tillery, North Carolina. Emissions were lowered in Southern California because of work that was done by Communities for a Better Environment, and those were significantly lowered emissions, and then you know, in terms of a broader vision of environmental justice, work to bring about and establish a healthy food program for the state of California. You know, environmental justice groups have been dealing with land use issues and zoning issues as early as the early 1990s. The example that really comes to mind for me is the relocation of tank farms, industrial tank farms, from the East Austin community in Texas. That is an area that was zoned as a result of the comprehensive plan and zoning laws going back to the 1920 and 1930s that made these areas unrestricted for land use areas, at which point, you know, the communities there were and prohibiting people of color from buying in other areas, and therefore relegating communities of color into areas like this. And that, if you want to move forward to 2010, in San Diego, Environmental Health Coalition, bringing together health workers and promotoras, got the city of San Diego to pass a general a west side specific land use plan for that area. In brownfields and community revitalization, you know, this is something that has emerged starting with the 1990s as a broad issue across the country. There are more than 450,000 brownfield areas, and there's a little bit of history here that I want to share with you, because as this issue was kind of emerging as a big national issue, I served as the chair of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council's Waste and Facility Siting Committee. And I thought that this would be an area that we really take on as an important one. So I proposed to EPA at that point that we hold public dialogues around this, because you know, as this brownfield issue was taking off, it was all about redeveloping brownfields and not about the context in which that has to be taking place in, which was, you know, to what end, which should be revitalizing communities. I told Administrator Carol Browner at that time that, you know, the brownfield train left a train station without a really important group of passengers, which are communities. And so EPA supported this. We ran around the country, and one of the places we went to have these dialogues was Detroit. And people like Donnell Wilkins and Grace Lee Boggs, and you know, were really kind of the message that was that they and others kind of spoke to and brought to EPA really helped to transform and lay the foundations for the current brownfield program at EPA. And that really is one that seeks to be very community oriented and looks from a view of how brownfields would support that vision of wholesale community revitalization. A great example of this is Spartanburg, South Carolina, which began with a $20,000 EPA environmental justice small grants, and has now leveraged nearly $300 million in public and private sector funding. Harold Mitchell, who's the leader of Regenesis and now is a state representative, held a celebration of this history a couple of weeks ago, and Jim Clyburn, the president, the state representative from there, long-time leader, was honored for all of his efforts to support this. In Port Arthur, this vision from the community of revitalization, I think is captured by what they wanted to do in terms of relocating a housing project that was next on the fence line of the Motiva plant, and then making the area green space as the center of a redevelopment for the neighborhood there, the Port Arthur West Side. So these are some of the things I think that the communities have brought in terms of their vision and the difference that they've made. But there's a lot of other in other sectors. There's also been a lot of things that have happened over the past 20 years. Environmental justice is now a part of, I think, all sectors of government, and I'm going to speak more to this later in terms of where particularly in terms of states. But, you know, NGOs and civil society have, you know, voices have come around this issue from all over. The Heinz Foundation has, you know, recognized environmental justice leaders like Peggy Shepard and Beverly Wright. The Goldman Environmental Prize recognized Kimberly Wasserman recently, and many others. And one of the people, one of the voices that I think is we should note in here is, you know, Hazel Johnson, who is now passed, but you know, she was the person that organized the first environmental organization in an African American housing project in Altgeld Gardens in Chicago's South Side, and she would tell you that one of the community organizers that she worked with in his youth was none other than the now President of the United States, Barack Obama. And in universities, there's environmental justice courses taught in virtually hundreds of universities. The amount of research that's being done has proliferated incredibly, and I will talk a little bit more on that in a second. But I think that I would say that you know, environmental justice is here to stay. Environmental justice is not just something on the periphery of American society, but it is very much in the mainstream. And for me, when I started on this back in the 1980s. For me to be able to look back and make a statement like that, that is pretty incredible. So just before I go on to you know, talking about government, EPA, and what it has been doing, I just want to note about the kind of research that's been done. You know, we had identified, and this is for the purposes of EPA's trying to make sure that environmental justice is considered in its rules, its analysis for its rulemaking and its for permits, that there's a number of factors that, you know, that we need to make sure we're considering, like proximity and exposure, cumulative impacts, been mentioned several times, susceptible populations, unique exposure pathways, the physical infrastructure, housing, social capital, and so on, ability to participate in decision making. And there's like a robust body of literature on each and every one of these things. And so part of what we're trying to do now is to, and I think there's the science of developing this is moving forward, is to say, how do you apply this to the decision-making process? We at EPA did a symposium on this called The Science of Disproportionate Impacts back a couple of years ago, out of which there's a major journal from the American Journal of Public Health on the issue. But I put this in at the last moment because I think this kind of, comes from Rachel Morello-Frosch from the University of California at Berkeley, and around the interplay of the societal, systemic, and community, and the way that that exposure impacts a particular individual, you know, throughout its course. And this is, I think, a good way to look at, and I think at EPA we're trying to understand how to operationalize this, how you take a lot of the factors that are related to environmental justice and understand how it modifies or affects the impacts of the pollutants that EPA regulates. And I think this is not an easy thing, but at least, you know, we're beginning to understand the interrelationships. This model comes from a symposium that took place here at the University of Michigan, sponsored by the School of Public Health. And I think Amy Schultz and Barbara Israel and a number of other people here were really participated in that. And so at the last moment, I put this in there, and I thought it would be important to kind of highlight that. So in the federal government, you know, going through this quickly, you know, I thought, you know, one of the ways of thinking about progress in the federal government was to say, you know, what happened in Clinton years, what happened in the Bush years, and what happened in the Obama years. But, you know, what I was distilled from that is that during the Clinton years, you know, it was really very formative. When the executive order was issued, the conversations I had with people in the federal government was, you know, what is environmental justice? I mean, it was really, really, really trying to understand what it was. And if you look at the documents that come from that period, it didn't say very much. And I think it did take people a long time to learn, to understand, you know, how to address these issues. The main thing that took place, I think, in terms of progress in the Bush years was there were very, very dedicated people at EPA that kind of, there wasn't going to be much happening on the regulatory front. So there was a lot of work working with communities to understand how to work together to develop collaborative problem solving. This led to like programs like the CARE, the Community Action for a Renewed Environment program, which has really kind of like made a big difference in many, many, many communities. And we're trying to build on that now. In the Obama years, you know, I would say the hallmark of what's been happening is to try to start to systematically integrate environmental justice in regulatory decision making, and that gets us to Plan EJ 2014. Plan EJ 2014 is EPA's roadmap to integrating environmental justice in its programs, policies, and activities. It has 10 major elements, you know, focused on things like rulemaking and permitting and enforcement, the development of basic tools, and you know, you see that all up there, and I'm going to start to list out some of the accomplishments and progress of where we are. So the first thing I want to talk about is a document that was issued in December of 2011, which is the Environmental Justice Legal Tools document. It is a compendium of discretionary legal authorities under the environmental statutes that can be used to address environmental justice. And this is really foundational because, and it is something that did actually take about 20 years to come into being. If you recall in the executive order, there was a presidential memorandum that was issued by President Clinton that talks to, well, you know, how are we going to address environmental justice? The executive order, you know, really doesn't speak to that. It just says federal agencies should identify and address disproportionate impacts, but it doesn't say how. And so President Clinton said that one should use the existing statutory authorities and, there's been effort to do this, but not until 2011 was there a comprehensive compilation of this issued and by the General Counsel of EPA. And Scott Fulton, who was the General Counsel at that time, said there are numerous opportunities to address environmental justice under our existing statutes. The second major item that I want to kind of talk about in terms of progress is EJSCREEN. And EJSCREEN is EPA's nationally consistent environmental justice screening tool. In the presentation about the Michigan environmental justice strategy, there was a reference to a thing called EJC, which is Environmental Justice Strategic Enforcement and Assessment Tool, which is a predecessor to this. But this is a much more comprehensive, nationally consistent tool that we developed and issued for internal use several years ago. EPA is preparing to release it publicly in about a month or so. End of October, early November is probably the best sense that we could give on when that would be. And I think that being able to make something like this available, the kind of information that it has in there would be really helpful towards all of us working together to address issues of environmental justice. The next item, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't, okay. The next item I want to talk about is incorporating environmental justice into rulemaking, and I just speak to this a little bit already. EPA is developing guidance in this area. We're completing, or the Science Advisory Board is completing its peer review for a set of technical guidance around assessing environmental justice in regulatory analysis, specifically national rules. The one thing I want to note about this, so if we want to take all that we've learned, one of the things that the guidance here does is to say that EPA in its rulemaking process should not be looking at just how we prevent harm, but we also need to make sure, or prevent disproportionate harm, but we need to make sure that the benefits of our rules are also equitably distributed. And that actually is a really major kind of advance in terms of how we're thinking, or EPA is thinking, about environmental justice. There's been a huge increase in environmental justice analysis. Some of the rules that are like the mercury air toxic rule, or the PM 2.5 National Ambient Air Quality Standards, are just the petroleum refinery rule. These are all rules in which there's been efforts to incorporate environmental justice. Part of what we need to do, and part of is to make sure that we are building the capacity in communities to take part in these processes. And so EPA's Air Office has been really trying very, very hard to do the kind of training that would begin to build that capacity. And these are not easy things to do, but I did mention this because I know that recently in March there was a major training on EPA's Clean Air Act here in Detroit, and I know many of you participated in that. And this is also something that we want to really make more more developed, more expanded, and more systematic. Advancing environmental justice in enforcement and compliance is something that I think is where we probably have made the most progress. And I did want to, before I go on, I was remiss in not saying this earlier. You know, there was a lot of people here that I know and I had wanted to recognize, but there was one person that I feel is not just, I felt really obligated to kind of recognize, which is Alan Waltz. Alan is the director. Alan, can you stand up? And he's the director of Region 5's Environmental Justice Program. And he's also heads up the enforcement area for Region 5. And so he'll probably be able to tell you more about this, but and I think it's partly because of his leadership that we have made so much progress in this area. And so EPA has thought about how to integrate environmental justice into all aspects of the enforcement life cycle. So this is a lot more developed in terms of how we select work and priorities, how we target and develop cases, how we make sure that environmental justice is considered in remedies, and making sure that where appropriate, there's community engagement. We are reviewing all enforcement actions for environmental justice concerns. This amounts to more than 3,000 per year. And I just mentioned here on the slide several of the major kind of results in communities that have taken place as a result of EPA's enforcement actions. The work that we're doing around permitting is oops. I forgot to mention this, but we are doing a lot of work around permitting and EJ analysis, starting with enhanced public participation and beginning to do EJ analysis for permits, eventually leading to identifying the types of terms and conditions for permits that we would like to see, and also outcomes that are not covered in permits. So I kind of skipped that, so I apologize. So the last area that in terms of just overall in terms of the federal government that is important to note is the work that's been done in terms of reinvigorating the Federal Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice. I know that, and you know that every time we go to have a conversation about environmental justice, it is, the point is well made that environmental justice is not just something that concerns EPA, but all agencies dealing with multiple types of issues. And in as a result of the Obama administration's emphasis on environmental justice, the Interagency Working Group was reinvigorated. The IWG restructured itself. It identified a number of focus areas. The National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, Goods Movement, Title VI, and climate adaptation. And then I just mentioned here some of the partnerships that the IWG works with. And want to focus a little bit of attention on the work done around NEPA. Some examples of, one example that kind of goes back to my earlier part of the presentation around, you know, the leadership that communities have provided is exhibited in this in this settlement or this agreement, a mitigation agreement that took place in the Charleston Marine Terminal expansion. And out of that process, which I don't think I have enough time to go into in detail, the communities were able to get a mitigation plan that included environmental monitoring, an affordable housing trust, a community park, and employment training programs and healthcare opportunities. And you know, this is, I think, you know, something that is of great significance to many communities, including those of you here in Detroit, because you here are also, you know, wrestling with goods movement issues. So an example like this is one of many best practices that's kind of emerged over the past 20 years. And a significant product that is going to come out of the federal environmental justice work is a compilation of best practices which form a set of basic analytical methods for considering environmental justice in the NEPA process. And this is really, I think, a step forward, and it goes back to you know, an important kind of turning point for progress under the executive order. Because, like I said, I always thought that NEPA was a touchstone of the executive order. It is also one of those things that President Clinton talked about in his memo. So, environmental justice at EPA, in the federal government after 20 years, is that, the way I would sum it up is that environmental justice is still very much the unfinished business of environmental protection. You know, I said in my blog that I would characterize progress on environmental protection at EPA and other parts of the federal government as being painfully incremental. You know, the operative word being painfully. And, you know, these are little baby steps, many of which are very significant, but, you know, it has taken a long time to come to this. And a lot of hard work and blood and sweat. And the other thing I would say about how I would, what I would want to, where I want all of this to go is that we need to expand the vision of the executive order. And that needs to reflect the vision and the progress that's taking place in communities. The executive order, you know, or how we begin to apply it needs to include much more so articulating the proactive benefits that's essential for building healthy and sustainable communities. And that is really important to me, I think, because you know, we really need to articulate through, you know, the way that we implement the executive order, a vision that that talks about how environmental justice is part and integrally part of the missions of all federal agencies. So, let me get to states, and this is my quickly one of the last area I will cover, and of course, you know, I thought it was important to spend some time on this because you know, this is a lot of the conversation here is at the state level, is about the work you do here in Michigan, and I want to provide some context for this. And so if you go back to 1994, only 4 states had EJ policies. And in 2014, virtually all states, District of Columbia and some territories, have legislation, policies, or programs around environmental justice. They're all in very different states of development and very, you know, there's some really great things happening. There are things that we can learn from. There are efforts which we all need to work together to improve and make more effective. But overall, we have to say that at the across the 50 states and District of Columbia, there's a sea change in terms of how environmental justice is understood on the state level. And the executive order was a original template, served as an original template for the first legislation or executive orders on a state level, like California's Environmental Justice Act or other things. But I think that what's happening in states is the policies are going, in many places, are going beyond that. And some of the things I've heard, in terms of the discussion here in Michigan, does go beyond that. And I thought that it would also be good now to kind of look at, so if we want to look to the future, what would some of those things be? And so I picked a few. And this is all the things I'm going to talk about. The couple examples I'm going to give are really because of legislation. And so, there are some larger processes that all go into this. But in Minnesota, there's legislation that calls for a cumulative risk assessment for one part of South Minneapolis. And so why they had a piece of legislation that only talked about one neighborhood in South Minneapolis, I'm not sure, but but it is legislation that says that cumulative risk analysis needs to be done. In New York, the power plant siting law, Article 10, calls for disproportionate impact analysis. And it is important to point out that New York also has legislation around brownfields in terms of area-wide planning and brownfield opportunities. Then I want to get to what I think is one of the most significant pieces of significant events, developments in the area of environmental justice and climate change. And that is California's SB 535. SB 535 is a piece of legislation that directs 25% of proceeds from the greenhouse gas fund to disadvantaged communities. It also says that 10% of those total funds have to be invested directly in those communities. Over the life of the greenhouse gas gas fund in California, that's going to be tens of billions of dollars. How are they going to determine what those disadvantaged communities are? They're going to use a thing called EJSCREEN. So that's California's version of EJSCREEN. And this is significant, in my opinion, for a couple of reasons. It does, this idea that, first of all, funds should be focused on and directed to those communities which are disadvantaged and need it the most. And the way we're going to choose those is not just going to look at the social economic factors, but also environmental factors are part of the definition of what is disadvantaged. And that is actually really unprecedented. So what SB 535, the coalition, which is led by community groups, want to see happen as a result of that are the things that I mentioned up here: greening projects and energy efficiency, renewable energy, transit-oriented development. All these things are being worked out now in terms of how they're going to develop the guidelines to implement this program in California. But like I said, I think that this is one of the most significant things to take place in the realm of environmental justice and climate justice. So I say that I called some of the things I just mentioned as, if we're going to look to the future, these are the harbingers of the future. So, making a difference in communities. When Administrator McCarthy said that one of her priorities, making a visible difference in communities, the challenge for us at EPA is to take what we have developed in Plan EJ 2014 and translate them into making a real difference. And to looking forward, how we're going to do that is not going to be possible if we do not build robust partnerships with states and tribes, local government, and other federal agencies. We need to really focus on, much more so, ways in which we take what we've learned about working in communities, working with communities, for communities to be leading efforts like those in Spartanburg and other places to bring those to scale. And that's what I mean when you say in holistic ways. We need to integrate environmental justice in EPA's programs. We just started developing the tools, and we need to implement them in ways that really result in risk reduction. And of course, we need to address climate justice and other critical issues of our time. So I wanted to end by giving you what I think is a great example, something which we have to replicate much more on a systematic way, what it means to make a visible difference in communities. And this is a set of remarkable slides. This is from EPA's Region 6. It is a before and after slide of what happens at a Equistar facility in the Houston Ship Channel. And this looks at, on the left-hand side, the plume for butadiene, which is a carcinogen, before EPA's enforcement actions. And several years later, you can see how that has shrunk. And this is a reduction from emissions of 112 tons per year to 32 tons a year. And if you're able to make it out, if you look on the upper left-hand side, upper left corner of the two maps, you will see where the community is. In the before slide, you see how the plume covers the community, and if you see on the right-hand slide, you see how that no longer covers that community. And I think this to me has always been what guides me in terms of what we need to do around environmental justice, which is to make that difference in communities. And we need to make it, the work that's going on now has produced many very important, significant results, and we need to figure out a way where we can be more targeted, more focused, and more systematic. So this is President Obama's words when he issued the proclamation on the 20th anniversary. He talks about what has happened, the progress over the past 2 decades, and what we need to do to move forward, particularly in the area of climate. So I will leave you with this thought. You know, I know that a lot of communities have said that the executive order is a toothless tiger. And I know that a lot of communities have said that, you know, that they don't see the difference that any of this has been making in their communities. And I know that we have a lot of work to do. But it is also important to recognize, and this is probably the hardest thing, the progress we made. Because if we don't recognize the progress we've made, we don't know what to build on. And if we don't recognize the progress we made, you know, the thing that's so important for us as we do our work, which is a real sense of hope, does not exist. And so as we look into the future and the kind of things that, the kind of issues we need to tackle, I think it is really important that as hard as it is, as painfully incremental as it is, that we do not lose sight of all the great work that we've done together. Thank you.